This is the Power Break Podcast number 178, titled Bitter or Better? Hi, everyone. I'm Bob Brubaker, along with JT, as we hope you'll stay tuned as we seek to give you a little power in this break to help you succeed in the race of life.
This is the Power Break Podcast with a focus on the spiritual, the mental, and the physical aspects, all to help you succeed in the race of life. For show notes from today's podcast, go to bobbrubaker.com and follow the link for the Power Break Podcast. Dude, how are you?
Well, as we record this, I'm recovering from a bicycle crash, but somebody said you had a bicycle crash too. What is up with this?
My excuse is that I was doing dumb stuff. That's usually why I crash. I was trying a trick and I pushed a little too hard, and old people fall down. So, how about you, dude? What happened with you?
Well, I was riding with Brooke, and he said there was a car coming around us, and so the car didn't come, and I was going through a gate. We were leaving out of a park, and as I was looking for that car, and I looked around to see where the car was, and my bike drifted to the right, and I hit a big post. Ouch!
Oh, man. Gosh, it's so... Yeah. I'm just glad you're all right, man. I have hit solid objects before. I went over backwards, and I guess the ground is a solid object, but, man, it's not like a post. So I'm just grateful that you're not hurt. And you and I, we do a lot of things together, but we really don't need to crash together.
Yeah. Well, we have something to tell the folks on the Power Break Podcast. Don't crash. It's not fun.
No, it's not fun. Yeah.
But what it is fun for us is doing this podcast every week, and we appreciate your support of this by listening, number one, number two, by telling your friends, and number three, leaving us a rating and or a review wherever you download the podcast. It really does help, and understand that we're now on Amazon Music, and so it'll gets out more and more all the time. So we appreciate you very much telling others and also leaving us a rating and or a review. Thank you.
Yep, we do appreciate it, and if you leave 5 stars, that pushes us right to the top when people do searches for, self-help. What category are we under? I don't even really know.
We're in a generalized category because it is a combination of sports. It's a combination of Christianity, and it is a combination of mental health. And so, we're just kind of in the general because I couldn't pick one.
Right, that's right.
And so, anyway, that's the way it is on Apple iTunes, and so that's how it goes. So here we are with the Power Break Podcast, number 178, and today we're talking about bitter or better. Now, that's not the German way of saying thank you.
Ein bitter.
I mean, danke bitte, right?
Right, that's right.
Okay, we're talking about being bitter, as in mad, going from mad to bitterness. Anyway, so the question is bitter or better. So JT, and we begin with a question for you. I know you've seen people be bitter in some ways. And so how have you seen this, that people have chosen to be bitter rather than better, and other people have chosen to be better rather than bitter when they've gone through difficulties? What would you say?
I've been guilty of both, to be honest with you, especially, before I became a Christian, and before I really started to have a relationship with Christ. I guess I had called myself a Christian way before I had a relationship with Christ, but it was hard, like when I was going through my career, and a lot of times, you see people that get promoted and you don't believe that was a really good choice, that you were the better choice. And, regardless of what the data that says, you were the better choice, the other person got it. And it's really hard for you not to become bitter when it happens over and over again. But what I noticed is that if you live in that bitterness, then it's a pretty miserable place to be, and it affects everything. It also affects your relationship with God, and it affects the way the Holy Spirit works inside of you. So it's a really bad place to be. But I've also seen people on the other side, and it's interesting. Granny used to say, and I knew that you would like the Granny thing.
Granny!
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, now a word from Granny from the past.
Yeah, I mean, she used to say all the time that a man isn't worth anything until he's 30 years old. But the reason why she said that is because as you go through life and you go through difficulties, your character is built. We talked about this a little bit on a recent podcast. But there's a character building process, and on the other side of the difficulty, there's actually more joy, more hope, more grace. Mm-hmm. But that's a conscious choice, isn't it, Bob?
It really is. And, that's what we want to talk about today, because there are some people who allow their circumstances to dictate how they feel in life. And many times they get bitter because they feel like they've been dealt a bad hand or whatever. And that bitterness, actually, even if it's pointed toward another person, is actually towards God. Right. And you'll never improve that way. But when we take it at God is doing something in our life to improve us, so we get better. So God does use difficulties in our lives to train us and to grow us, but also to test us, to allow us to see how far we need to go in our walk with Him and in our maturity. So none of us have arrived yet. So the result of any form of or trial, any given trial, is we either grow and get better or we become bitter. And it's really a stunting of our spiritual growth and maturity. Two distinct results of times of struggle or difficulty. And as we close out the year of 2021, we like to say, let's do an assessment of whether we are bitter or better, the things we've faced this past year. And a good scripture to go by when it comes to bitterness was what the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 12 and verse 15, "See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled." So today it's a consideration of the bitter or the better.
Man, let's continue to talk more about that as we turn to your blog. Folks, if you haven't been to BobRubaker.com, get over there. Check out the resources. We're constantly adding to that website. So yeah, head over there. At the very least, sign up so you get the blog every Monday. Shows up. Good way to start your week. But let's continue to talk more about your blog, Bitter or Better.
Well, as I wrote on the blog, just some highlights here that the question is, how were things for you over this past year? Although 2021 was an improvement for the most part over 2020, most people will say. Most people have categorized the past 2 years as something of the quote-unquote less desirable state, to say the least. If we aren't careful, though, we can dwell on the negative so much that we'll find ourselves in a tailspin that will actually lead down to the road of negativity, which is called bitterness. None of us want that, and so what do? How can we prepare for the coming year, even though this past year has had its ups and downs, and for many people, more downs than ups, whatever it is? One way to question ourselves is to ask whether we are either better or bitter over what has taken place in our lives this past year. Am I better for having gone through the difficulties of 2021 and 2020? God expects improvement in our conformity to the image of Jesus Christ from every situation. Otherwise, it would not be necessary for us to face those situations. I like to refer constantly to Romans 8:28 through 30, and it gives us that perspective, the fact that everything in our lives is working for our good. Particularly, our good is that we're conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. And in 1 Peter chapter 1, it says, if it is necessary, you're grieved by various trials. So if it wasn't necessary, you wouldn't even have it. So oftentimes we feel like God is chastening us, which actually in the Scriptures means son training. So He is training us and testing us so that we know the way to go and know that during difficulties we can turn to Him and find strength and help in that time of difficulty. So when you read Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 through 10, you'll find that talking about testing and going through the times of even chastisement. We feel like that. In James chapter 1, he talks to count it all joy when you face trials of various kinds, for the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect or mature, complete, and lacking nothing. To say the least, the difficulties that we face are not easy, but he says, count it joy. Count it joy, JT, when you go through difficulties, because God is testing your faith to produce that attribute called steadfastness. Whoa.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and that, you know, we talked a little bit, we were just on another podcast with our guys over at Strong by Design, but we were talking about hope. And, you know, hope is built through trial and character building. Hope becomes stronger out of that, you know, and hope is really, for me, the driving force. You know, that's why I love this time of year. But man, you know, there's times, I got to be honest with you, where, you know, I love when James talks about count it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of many kinds. You know, there's some times where I've just looked up and been like, wow, this is a whole lot of joy, God. I'm not entirely sure I'm cool with this, but you know, it's, at the other end, you know, there's a quickening that happens, through the whole process. You know, you were really the guy that really was able to help me understand that, you know, the whole process of becoming more like Christ is a process. You know, there's not this, you know, you decide you're going to follow Christ and the next day you're a better person. That's just not how that works. Or you're a mature Christian. Maturity comes through trials, and maturity comes through, you know, being broken and and becoming more reliant on God. So, this is such a great way to start the year, Bob. So I'm really appreciative you picked this topic.
Well, we want to look back, of course, where the Apostle Paul says he doesn't focus on what is behind, but he focuses on what is ahead. But it's good to look back and do an assessment. And during the times we have had difficulties, I guarantee you, even if you haven't experienced it or you say, that isn't mine, we can guarantee that this has been the case. Even as Paul, when he was going through the thorn in the flesh, we don't know what that is, and he asked the Lord 3 times to remove it. And each time, what did God say? My grace is sufficient for you.
That's right.
Yeah. Yep. And so Paul says, well, you know, his strength is made perfect in my weakness, so I'll be content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. For when I am weak, then I'm strong. There again, that with the more we understand that, we get better in that situation rather than bitter, because we understand we can't do it, we can't go forward, but his promise is that he'll be with us. And so we learn to be more and more dependent upon him, right, which is honoring to him, and actually is the only way we can go through the time. The bottom line is this, is very simple. You have to have well, everybody wants to have a good year coming up, so you have to look back and say, how did I grow through the difficulties, the struggles, and the trials of this past year? Well, that means confessing and repenting over those things that you didn't handle the best, according to what the Bible says, and it means renewing your commitment to stay close to God through prayer and meditation on His Word, and be faithful in dedication and participation in your local church. To be better from struggles means you also make it a constant, dedicated effort to put down or dig out and destroy every form of bitterness. And that means bitterness against anybody else, bitterness against your situation, because all bitterness expressed is actually bitterness towards God. And you'll recognize it by being, you know, the bitterness by being when you're quick to complain, to judge, and even curse God. So the choice is yours as we go back and forth, going back to this past year and looking back on it and going forth to the next year. Do you want to be bitter, or would you like to be better?
So good, man. So what's happening, Bob? Any news we need to know about this week?
Well, as you check out the blog at bobbrubaker.com, I ask you to check out also the things that I have there for your instruction and encouragement. And one of the words of encouragement is my book called One Breath from Death, from when I was in the hospital and I was dying from a Pseudomonas bacterial infection in my lungs, and I went to National Jewish Medical Center, and they took a long time to figure out what was wrong, and when I had a lung biopsy, my lung collapsed. It was a lot of things, but God gave us the spirit of gratitude through that, and it was really a time when I learned that I wanted to be better, not bitter. So you'll find that story. That's called One Breath from Death, Look What God Can Do. You'll find the book at bobbrubaker.com. When you click on the resources, scroll through the resources to the books, and through the books you'll find it. One Breath from Death, Look What God Can Do. And while you're there, check out the sermon links to the sermons that I preach here at Christ Community Presbyterian Church in Clearwater, Florida. You'll find those sermon links and everything else at bobbrubaker.com.
This is the Power Break Podcast. I'm JT along with Bob Brubaker, and this is time on the podcast for questions and answers. If you have a question for me or Bob, feel free to email me at jt@bobbrubaker.com, and we'll get to answering that on an upcoming Power Break podcast. So question number one, my friend, we are going to start from the spiritual side of life. Are you ready?
It's like you're always surprised that that's where we're going to start.
I know. Like
you're all right.
It hasn't been the same script for this long, but I'm not the brightest bulb on the porch, as Grandma used to say. So
yeah, the guy with the master's degree. And by the way, everybody that has come in my office has really appreciated your work. If this was we had video going, I would put the camera on the work that you did on the placard that you made with the 3 crosses.
Awesome.
The woodworking. You are quite the artiste, man.
I'm an artiste, all right. No, I just really, I think you and I had that conversation. I love wood because when you cut it, you never know how it's going to look because it's always different. It's just such a beautiful thing to work with. Right now I made that for you. I made a sign for one of my friends. He's got a van and he named it. So, because you always got to name your van. It's like naming a boat, right?
Yeah.
And then I made a cutting board, a traditional block cutting board. So I alternated with walnut and poplar wood, and I made that for Amy's mom. And now I'm about halfway through a table, which is actually turning out awesome. I was like, man, that's
wow.
Yeah, and it's I learned a flame technique where you actually accent the wood with flame, and it brings out the natural growth marks in the wood. They call it spring wood versus hardwood. And that's what causes that kind of accent inside the wood. So, but when you burn it, the spring wood gets darker than the hardwood. So it brings out the actual texture of the wood a lot better. So I just learned that technique and it turned out beautiful. So I'll send you a picture, but
I'm impressed, JT. I'm impressed, man.
Hey man, who said you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? All right. So surprisingly, we are going to get back to the spiritual side of life. So here we go. Are you ready?
Yeah.
All right. Question number 1 is actually a 3-part question. So first, can we say for certain that God has a purpose for every trial, difficulty, or struggle in our lives? If so, why? And what should we do?
Well, first of all, let's say the answer to the first part is absolutely yes. God does have a purpose for it. We have that assurance in Romans 8 and verse 28 when he says, we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good to those who are called according to his purpose. For those he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. Okay, so he has a purpose for us because his purpose is that we would be conformed in our character to that of Jesus Christ because we belong to the family of God. And so that's what our character is being developed now, to shine forth to those around us and even to God himself what he's doing in our lives. And so he goes on to say in Romans 8, he says, for those he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And he says, and those whom he predestined, he also called, and those whom he called, he justified, those whom he justified, he also glorified. Now watch this. He says, what shall we say to these things? That if God is for us, who could be against us? Now we take comfort in that, right? Right. So then we go over to 1 Peter chapter 1 when he talks about we're being born again to a lively hope by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The power of the resurrection is seen within us, that we believe according to the same power that raised Christ from the dead, according to Ephesians chapter 1. Then he says, in this you rejoice. We rejoice in the fact that we're born again by the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And he says, though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved through various trials, that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So, when we look at what's going on in our lives, remember from Job chapter 1, when Satan was questioned by God, where have you been? And he says, walking to and fro on the earth. And what did God say? Have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him on all the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil.
Right.
So here's Job. He lives a righteous life, and God allowed Satan to test him to prove Job. And I would say when you're going through a proving time, that's exactly what's going on.
Right.
That Satan tries to bring you down, and God says, watch this. I mean, JT's faith will shine forth.
Right.
And so, yes, it does. We do know that we will be tested, okay? And God has a purpose for everything. So why does this happen? It is to conform us to a more mature Christianity in our character. And that happens through trial or testing to display the genuineness of our faith, or even sometimes even to chasten us to change, to get back on track. And so as we find in James chapter 1 and also Hebrews chapter 12. And that's, of course, we look at Job and we look at 1 Peter. Now, the third point is, what should we do? And that is to cooperate with the working of the Spirit of God and stop resisting, which leads us to bitterness. In other words, cooperate through drawing close to God during the times of affliction and not murmuring or complaining, but rather finding a reason to be grateful during every situation. Also looking for opportunities to minister to others, because we're to minister with the grace that we've been given to others, and it multiplies that grace. And also realize that we have a testimony in the world, and we need to be ready to answer for the reason for the hope that is within us, and that hope shines forth as we go through various trials. So that's what we do. We cooperate with the working of the Spirit, and we stop and put on the brakes and realize we're so prone to bitterness, complaining, or judgment, or even cursing God. And so stop, put the brakes on, realize here's what I want to do, and make that plan before it happens.
Yeah, I'm always reminded that God uses you whether you're consciously seeking Him or not. I saw over and over again people at my work throughout my life. You can say basically anywhere, any position that I had in life. There were people who didn't believe in God, but it was pretty evident that God was still using them for His good, for the good of other people, for the good of an agency, for the good of whatever, And I always think about Jonah. It was like, he's like, hey, go to Nineveh. No, I don't like those people. They don't deserve it. There's no way I'm going to go to Nineveh. Yeah. No, I'm going to get on a ship. I'm going to go the opposite direction. Go to Nineveh. No. Okay, I'm going to sink the ship. Go to Nineveh. No. I mean, it was just over and over and over again. And that defiance, that bitterness, that, all those things could have been avoided if Jonah just went to Nineveh. But what it showed was, you're going to go on that ride whether you want to or not. You might as well be in alliance with God while you're doing it.
Well, that's for sure, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, he's going to use you no matter what. So you might as well just be like, hey, God, send me, and that makes it to where you get the joy that He wants you to have doing His work. I mean, we were put here to work, to do His work. So
that's right.
So you only experience that joy if you turn yourself over to that. So from the mental aspect, so how do we mentally keep from becoming bitter? Maybe we should talk about recognizing symptoms of bitterness first, because I have had them for sure. Well, it wasn't the flu; it was bitterness.
Yeah, it feels like the flu. Actually, it's kind of the flu mentally and spiritually, because you become mad at God, you're mad at others, just a voice of complaining all the time, voice of judgment all the time, or even gossiping.
Right.
So those are kind of the symptoms that come out. So how do we avoid that? It's a matter of focus. Focus on Christ and His Word in order to stay close to Him, and recognize the symptoms of bitterness that are so prone about us. If you read the old Puritans and all, they were people that said, if not for the grace of God, I'd be in a very bad shape. Right. And so they realized that God had saved them from this, but they still had the capability. And that is so important for us to realize. We have the capability of being very, very bitter people, and even so much so that, as it says in Hebrews 12, we're to stamp out even the root of bitterness. No, you don't just stamp it out. You cut it out, and that means you work at it. And, of course, that bitterness is sin, and so we need to confess and forsake it immediately if it pops up in our lives. Even here's what he says. If we think that it's not a problem, it's not really a big deal. Proverbs 28 verse 13 says, whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will find mercy. So mentally then, an emphasis on the need for the participation in times of spiritual growth is like an athlete in training. That means that when those things happen, we want to realize that God is allowing this test in my life, and here's my opportunity to improve. Just like you, JT, when you go to that mountain to ride your bike up the mountain, it's hard.
It is hard, yeah, but it's I know what I'm getting out of it on the other side.
That's right.
Yeah, and that's the important thing to keep in mind. You know, I look at the times in my life when I was bitter, and you know, usually it was because, you know, you nailed the complaining and being around gossiping. Like, it's so hard for me now, like, to turn on the news because I feel like it's no longer news. I feel like it's gossiping. Like, I feel like it's basically, you know, no matter, like Fox, no matter what, is going to blast the president. CNN, no matter what, is going to blast the former president. And a lot of it I don't even believe is true. I believe it's opinion. I believe it doesn't, you know, so, but what it feels like is being judging and gossiping as opposed to just reporting the news. So if that's what we're kind of surrounded by, it's really important for us to kind of weed that out of our life, you know, or take everything with a big grain of salt, you know.
Yeah, we need to be people of truth. And where do you find the truth? Let's see, the scriptures.
Yeah, that's it. That's a period, right?
Yeah, that is the truth. Or Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me. So focusing on the Lord Jesus Christ, focusing on his word, filling our lives with that keeps us from going down the trail of bitterness.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so question number 3, as always, we are going to turn to the physical aspect of life. Let's talk about getting better sleep to train better in the coming year, because sleep is one of the most neglected things, especially when you're young. You get in a bad habit because you tend to be able to operate on a deficit better and more effectively, but you build fatigue a lot more as you get older.
That's
so
right.
let's talk about that, because that's huge. If you want to make gains, getting good sleep is a big deal.
It's such a big deal that they say that it has a lot to say about a person's proneness to diabetes, to heart condition, to Alzheimer's. And, I mean, it goes on. The list is amazing. And they said the first thing you can do is make sure you get a good sleep. And there are many instruments. You know, I use the Whoop, Whoop Whoop, as JT says.
The toot toot, Whoop Whoop. Yeah.
Whoop Whoop, yeah. And it gives me a score on my sleep every night, and even tells me how much REM sleep and how much deep sleep I get. And there are other things out there. There's a ring, what is it, Aura ring or something like that.
Yeah.
And then there are other things that help to, it's amazing, the old saying is true, the things that you quantify, the things that you check, and all,
you
those
measure,
are the things that measure, that's the word, those are the things you seem to improve. But and just some ways to think about in the coming year to get better sleep is, first of all, cutting the caffeine and curbing the alcohol, especially later in the day, okay? Yeah. And then the second thing that they recommend is to go dark before going to sleep. Now, that means the room needs to be dark. It's amazing how a little bit of light in the room can actually do deficits to your sleep. But also the fact going dark means turning off the screens, the TV and the iPhone, or turning off the computer before. Many people work right up to the time they go to bed, or they're watching TV right up to the time they go to bed, and it's actually having a negative effect on your sleep. And the other thing they recommend is hot to cold. That means a hot bath or hot shower and a cold room will help you sleep better.
Wow, interesting.
And then the other thing they mentioned that you hadn't thought about probably is the consistent evening routine. Of course, they say that for little children, you know, to be a real consistent routine helps them sleep well. Well, it works for adults too, you know, and having a consistent time of both going to sleep and also waking up. So, any thoughts that you have, JT? I mean, you probably sleep pretty good up there in the mountains, huh?
I do, yeah. I don't have to worry about a cold room. I'll tell you that right now. But, I wanted to clarify what you were talking about, cut caffeine and curb alcohol. And you said especially in the morning. The morning part was the caffeine. Don't be drinking in the morning, number one. Let's clarify that right out of the box. As soon as you said that, I'm like, we're not trying to tell people to drink in the morning. Anyway.
Thank you, JT, for helping me.
You're welcome. This public service announcement was brought to you by JT.
That's why we're a team, folks.
But it's funny how much temperature really, really affects you as far as like getting good sleep, as far as getting recovery. I've actually noticed that I seem to recover quicker up here. Now, part of that probably is I'm in a great sleep routine now that I don't have to worry about the really unhealthy shifts that I had to work as a police officer, because those shifts are just brutal on your body over the years. So now that I'm actually in a position to where I can get to sleep at the same time, usually I'm in bed by like 9:30, 10 o'clock, and I get up at the same time to take the kids to school. And as far as I like being outside when it's cold, not like freezing, but I like being outside when it's cold. And for some reason, I just feel like my body recovers better in it. So I think there's a lot of validity to all that stuff, Bob. Yeah. Good stuff.
Well, it pays to think about your sleep, but it, of course, takes discipline. And as we always say, discipline makes the difference in all aspects of life. Check out today's show notes at BobBrubaker.com. Click on the Power Break podcast. Today is show number 178.
And submit your questions by email to jt@bobbrubaker.com and listen for my answer or Bob's answer on an upcoming Power Break podcast.
Quick word for the One Breath from Death book that I have for you at BobBrubaker.com. It's a story of when I was one breath from death. Look what God can do. Wow, it's a great story, not because I'm in it, but because God did a wonderful work in my life, and I want to share that with you. Check it out at the books. You click on the resources, and then go to the books, and you'll scroll through the books. You'll find it, One Breath from Death, Look What God Can Do, at BobBrubaker.com.
Well, thank you for joining us for the Power Break podcast. Please subscribe and leave a review wherever you've downloaded the podcast, and check out show notes, news, Bob's weekly blog, and other cool things at BobBrubaker.com. And listen next time for the Power Break podcast.